Hello, everyone, and welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. Today, I'm going to be talking about the topic of functional language. I will start by discussing what functional language is, and we'll look at some examples. I will discuss why it is important to teach functional language to all students. I will then look at some problems functional language can present for teachers and learners. I will then demonstrate how teachers can use the PPP model to teach functional language, and we'll provide some useful activities that you can use for each stage of the lesson. Finally, I will discuss why intonation and stress can play a role in how the message is communicated and understood, and we'll demonstrate how teachers can focus on this during the lesson. So, let's begin by answering the question, what is functional language? In simple words, it is language we use for day-to-day situations. The focus is on the purpose of the message. We use specific language to perform various functions, which we refer to as functional exponents in the teaching world. Functional exponents can be fixed phrases or single words, which are used to perform a function. The language we choose to use differs depending on the relationship of the people involved in the communication. For example, asking a boss to leave early versus asking your brother to lend you £100. So, for example, what would you say to your boss? You might say to your boss, would it be okay if I left early today? How does that differ if you ask your brother to lend you £100? This would be, let me borrow £100. So, there's a big difference between the two. So, the relationship we have with someone determines which exponents we use to communicate with them. Our students need to be able to use language for different situations and needs to ensure the language that they use is appropriate for the situation. So here are some typical examples of functional exponents we could teach our students to help them to communicate more effectively in various situations they might find themselves in. Okay, as you can see, I have only given one example for each function. And there are several phrases that we could teach our students for each one. Okay. Um, but the idea is what our students need to know is which situations particular exponents are appropriate for, what are inappropriate. So let's look at the first example. So when would you use this? Would you mind? Okay, well, imagine that you're on a train, it's very hot, and you're not near the window, but someone else is, a stranger. So you could say perhaps to them, excuse me, you wouldn't mind opening the window, would you? Okay, that's better than just saying, open the window. Okay, it's impolite. So think about your students. We want them to be able to choose appropriate language in various situations so that they can communicate effectively, just like we do. Why teach functional language? Well, your students may know a lot of lexis and have good grammar knowledge. This doesn't mean they know what to say when faced with different life situations. They need to be able to communicate with correct level of formality and in a clear way. Teaching language by function or situation was first proposed in the 1970s by a linguist called D.A. Wilkins. And in the 1990s, another linguist called Michael Lewis wrote The Lexical Approach, the State of English Language Teaching and a Way Forward. In the book, he put together the conceptual foundations for effectively teaching a second language. The Lewis theory is that grammar comes second to lexis or words. And by words, he's actually referring to language chunks or phrases. Let's have a think now about language chunks that we use on a daily basis. So I'm talking about language that we find usually or commonly together in English. So, for example, best wishes or get well soon. As native speakers, we use thousands and we use them every single day. Lewis believed that language consists of these chunks. And the key to achieving fluency in a language is the nuanced use of these phrases. So, as native speakers, we use these phrases every single day without focusing on the grammar or the meaning. We just speak. We know that these words go together because they sound right. Lewis and his lexical approach present linguistic fluency as the ability to readily and quickly gather phrases for different situations. We communicate by using thousands of these. So why shouldn't language teaching reflect this reality? Teaching language chunks speeds up acquisition because students are adding to their language bank more quickly. Instead of having to process individual words and then figuring out their meaning or how they relate to each other and how, like, grammatically, they are dealing with chunks of language instead. So building fluency one phrase at a time. Teaching set phrases, for example, is practical and immediately relevant for our students. This is highly motivating for our students. Learning quickly, able to speak in a variety of situations right from the beginning, appropriate language for various situations equals meaningful communications for the real world. So think of home and social life. Think of it this way. If you had a Japanese businessman living in Tokyo who needs language for negotiating, so language like, I'm afraid I can't go along with that. Or another possibility is to, if we teach him useful language for these situations that he needs to be able to communicate in English with, then he'll sound more professional. He'll be using appropriate language within the context of business meetings. For example, if he needs to be able to use his language in business meetings, that is. This ensures a better flow of communication and inevitably improves working relationships, doesn't it? The same can be applied to, for example, if you had a Russian student living in the UK, he would need lots of functional language for a variety of situations. If he's living with a host family, for example, he would need lots of social English. He needs to go out and buy food. He needs language for buying food in a restaurant. For inviting and suggesting, he needs a lot of functional language. So his language syllabus would be formed of a lot of functional language, a lot of functional exponents. That being said, is it possible to teach only functional language and not focus on grammar? Well, in my opinion, if functional language is a part of the syllabus and is used alongside other methods and approaches, it can be very effective. One of the drawbacks to typical ELT syllabus is that the language teaching is often based on the presentation and practice of grammatical structures, essentially a grammar based syllabus. Think about the structures with would, for example. Okay, these tend to appear in later stages of a syllabus, actually, as it's considered to be more complex. In a typical course book for beginner level, very simple phrases are taught. So, for example, for real life language, for buying food in a cafe, they might be taught 3 coffees, please, or how much is that? In fact, in the real world, would is used very, very frequently. So, would you like anything else? We hear that every single day. It's high frequency language. So, in a functional syllabus, would appears very early on. Another potential issue for teachers is which order do we teach functions? For example, is it more important to be able to complain or make a suggestion? I guess it depends on the needs of your students. It's important to consider what your students' needs are, and this will come down to where they are living or working and who they need to be able to communicate with. Is it English for every day or is it English for negotiating? Another tricky one, it can be difficult for students to learn many phrases that differ widely in grammatical structure. When the level of formality changes, the grammar tends to change too. So, would you mind turning the radio down, please, versus turn the music down? Okay. Think about the relationship for each situation in those examples. So maybe in the first one, you're talking to a stranger. In the second one, turn the music down. It's a mother talking to her son. So, of course, the formality changes. Students need to be able to use appropriate language within different contexts. I mean, would it be appropriate for us to think that if one of our students goes home and says to their son, would you mind awfully turning the music down, please? That would be appropriate? I don't think so. So it's up to us. It's our job to ensure that they're using the language appropriately in the correct the right situation. I mean, think, have I done my job there? Probably not. So when deciding on what language or exponents to teach, always make the context clear. Okay, so how many structures should you present in one lesson? Well, think about the context again. In which context are they going to be using the language? Is it in a formal versus informal situation, a conversation with a friend or a boss? So you wouldn't necessarily teach them lots of formal and informal uses together in one lesson. Just stick with one. This should narrow it down quite a lot. I suggest not focusing on more than two related functions per lesson. So, for example, related functions would be giving advice and offering suggestions, or offers and requests. The reason I would teach these together is because they're usually found together naturally in English, so it makes sense to teach them together in the classroom. Also, we must consider that a single utterance can perform a variety of functions and contain a number of notions. For example, I am only going to be here for 3 months. It's a simple declarative statement, but its function will be decided by um, many things. So it could be an announcement, it could be a threat, it could be an excuse. Okay, so we must think about how it's said, for example, like the intonation. Think of the tone of voice. So imagine if it is used as an excuse. You might say, well, I'm only going to be here for 3 days. Think about which words are stressed. Think about the intonation. Okay. So all of this plays a huge role. Okay. So let's look at a typical PPP structure and consider how we can use it to teach functional language. Well, to start with, of course, we have the lead in. And what's the purpose of a lead in? It's to set the context of the lesson, engage the students in the topic, activate their current knowledge and language of the topic. We want to see how much our students already know. You should set up the lead in to elicit what they know, and it should encourage students to use a target language if they know it. I'll give an example of this shortly. Then, of course, we have the presentation. We need to provide a clear context so students know in which situations to use the language we are teaching them. Remember, appropriacy. This could be a reading text, a listening, or something else. Think about what is the best way to convey the meaning clearly. So after they've seen the language, the target language in a context, we always ask the CCQs, remember, to establish when we use the language. We model and drill it for correct pronunciation, and then we put the form up on the board. Okay. Then, of course, we have the practice stage, where students are given the opportunity to use the target language in a controlled way until they feel comfortable and confident using it. And of course, in this stage, the teacher is heavily monitoring and correcting at this stage. If your students are making mistakes at this stage, there's no way you can go on to the production stage. Okay. Then, of course, we have the production stage where students feel more able to use the language appropriately and are provided with more choice over the language that they use. So let's look at a clear example of a lead-in to start with, and then we'll look at some example practice and production activities. Okay, so let's imagine we are teaching functional language for giving advice and making suggestions. So we could tell a story and have some little pictures here to help us make the meaning clear. So, for example, you could say, "Oh, I love shopping. I really, really, really love shopping. And, I really need to get to the shops. I'm desperate. But the problem is my car is broken down. So what am I going to do, students? This is a really terrible situation. What am I going to do?" Okay. So using pictures, you're telling them the story, and then you're asking your students to give you some advice. Okay. In this way, of course, it's interactive. Your students are involved in the story. And also, they're giving you the target language if they know it, because the way you've set up the activity, they would have to use the target language if they knew it. Okay, so it creates the need to use phrases for giving advice and making suggestions because of the way that it's been set up. So that could be your lead in. So I love shopping. My car is broken down. How can I get to the shop, students? Okay, so let's look at an example listening extract that you could use. So this is just a short extract that I've come up with myself. you could record it yourself, but of course you would need someone else, like a fellow teacher, to play the other part. So you've got one person playing Sarah and one person playing Sally. You wouldn't be able to do both by yourself. You would look a little bit strange. Okay. Um, so you could create this yourself, or if you wanted to, you could find something that is appropriate for the context online. Unfortunately, though, this is a little bit harder to find. Okay, so I find if there's something specific you want your learners to learn, some specific target language, then it's better to create your own dialogue if you're doing a listening. What I will say though is try to find a text that is authentic, or at least which has authentic features in it. So if you look at mine, it's got some fillers like well. It's we use fillers in conversation all the time. So as long as there are some authentic features, then it should be okay. Also, make sure people don't speak too slowly or enunciate too clearly, because we know this does not happen in real life. Natural features of speech, um, really think about as natural as possible. Always explain the context as well for your students. So say, okay, you're going to hear two sisters speaking. One's called Sally and one's called Sarah. Okay, give their names. You might have students in other countries that have never heard these names before. Okay, they're completely new. So make sure you say they're both female, they're sisters, one Sally, one Sarah. And then, of course, set your question, your gist question, or question for overall understanding. Okay. So in this case, you could say, "What is Sally's problem?" Play the recording. Then they've got a general understanding. Of course, then you would follow with detailed questions, which encourage your students to focus on the target language itself. So, for example, does Sarah try to help Sally? What does she suggest? Etc. Then, to check answers, I would encourage giving your students the script written down, or the tape script as it's called, so that they can then check their own answers. Because what we want to do is encourage learner autonomy whenever possible. We want to create independent learners. So, students have been exposed to the target language within a suitable context. They would have heard the correct or natural pronunciation from the recording, and through the questions you ask them, you're eliciting the target language, which is suggestions in this case. Then ask the CCQs to check their understanding. For example, so does Sarah tell Sally to take the bus? Or is it just an idea? Does she have to do it? Or is it just a suggestion? Of course, then you would do some modeling and drilling of the target language and put the form up on the board. Okay, so this is where we would deal with the pronunciation. So when you're teaching functional language, pronunciation is pretty important. So you've got your example sentences up on the board. Okay, you make sure to highlight any patterns. So for example, think about the language that was in the listening extracts. We had how about, we had should, and we have could. It's language for making suggestions. So would your students need to know that how about is followed by verb ing? Absolutely. Whereas should and could are followed by the infinitive. So your students need to know this is what you need to highlight on the board, but whenever possible, elicit. If you've done enough modeling and drilling of that target language, your students should be able to tell you. So students, how about plus, is it followed by infinitive or verb ing? Verb ing, miss. Excellent. Okay, because you've done enough modeling and drilling of the target language, they should be able to give that to you at that stage at the board. Okay, so of course, at this stage, we need to focus on the stress and the intonation patterns. Okay. Um, so, for example, if I said, well, you could wake up early, you could wake up early. Which word is stressed? Well, it's could, isn't it? Well, you could take the bus. Why is that stressed? Well, by stressing the correct word, you make it easier for people to grasp the meaning. If you put emphasis on the wrong word, you would change the meaning. In this case, could is stressed to highlight that a suggestion is coming, so listen out. You could take the bus. So students need to know that if you stress could, it's actually a part of the message because it's telling you that the suggestion is coming next, so listen out. Also, intonation. When you're dealing with intonation at this stage, I would say it's quite important to exaggerate whenever possible. Okay, well, it is possible at this stage. Exaggerate. You could say, "Well, why don't you ask mum?" Or, "Well, you should ask mum." Okay, so you're exaggerating the intonation at this stage. Um, then I would get students to come up to the board, get them out of the seats, and say, "Okay, where where's the intonation? Where does it rise and where does it fall in the sentence? Would you mind turning the music down, please?" Okay, versus turn the music down. You can see the intonation is very different. Is it important for your students to know that? Absolutely. So you can exaggerate the expressions with the exaggerated intonation, get your students out of their seats and mark up above the sentences, above the phrases, where the intonation rises and where the intonation falls. Okay, it's really important for your students because it helps to communicate the message in an appropriate way. Generally, intonation rises when we're being polite. Students will be better understood if they use appropriate intonation patterns. You could even, ask them, how is this person feeling when they say turn the music down or they're angry? And what happens with the intonation? Well, it certainly doesn't rise. It tends to fall. Turn the music down. Okay. You could even model the incorrect intonation and ask students, what's wrong here? This could be really, really fun. Okay. Make the most of it. Make it as fun as you can. Exaggerate, exaggerate, exaggerate. Okay, so let's look now at once you've done all the intonation stuff. Of course, then we would look at the practice side. Your students need to be able to practice using the language in a controlled way. I would choose perhaps two practice activities for functional language. So I'm going to put all these. I mean, this is not all of the practice activities you could do. It's an example of some that you could do. So I would choose at least two practice activities for functional language. One that has perhaps more of a focus on just the form, and the other focusing maybe on the form and the pronunciation. So, for example, dialogue that's in the wrong order, get your students to put it into the correct order, and then they can role play it using appropriate intonation. So that's quite a good one, actually. The second one on the list, ranking. So you could get students to rank most polite through to the most impolite language. So back to the example we had before. Would you mind awfully turning the music down, please? Is very polite. And turn the music down is very, very impolite. Okay. And then you've got the neutral ones in the middle. Could you turn the music down? So, of course, your students would have learned all this from you already, and the intonation patterns to go with these phrases. And so you could do then a ranking task. They could do it in pairs. It's probably better they do it in pairs. They feel more comfortable with that. Okay, so another one is matching the functions on the left with the functional exponents on the right, for example. So um, you could have language for agreeing and language for disagreeing on the right. So you'd have the function of agreeing, disagreeing on the left, and then the language or the exponents for those on the right, and then get students to match them up. Okay, so it's quite a simple one, but it's a good practice task. Okay, the last one can be pretty fun actually. So you can have a couple of dialogues, and one utterance is out of context in each of those dialogues. Okay, so for example, you've got a conversation between a boss and a worker, yeah, an employee, and the employee wants to go home early because he has a dentist appointment. So in the conversation, he might be asking his boss nicely, and then all of a sudden say, "Oh, all right, I'm out of here, okay?" That's obviously not appropriate. You wouldn't say, "I'm out of here, okay?" to your boss if you wanted to go early. You'd say, is it okay if I leave early? Or would that be okay? So you would give your students these, situations where one utterance is really out of context, and then you can get them to actually put in a correct or more appropriate expression, phrase, whatever. Um, and then they could have the dialogue. They could role play the dialogue together in pairs using the correct intonation patterns. So that's a fun one that you can do. Okay, so practice another one. Actually, this is just correcting mistakes. It's a typical practice task that you can do. So perhaps you've noticed that your students are making a lot of the same mistakes. So you can note them down, and then one day you can say, okay, I'm going to use this. You can use it at any time. You can use it within the PPP lesson after teaching the functional language, or you can even do this activity another day just to, find out how much they've remembered. So the idea is there are incorrect sentences, and students work together in pairs and correct the sentences. So what about asking her out for dinner? Of course, is correct, and so on. Okay, another practice activity is ordering. As I said before, ranking activities are quite fun. Order these in terms of their politeness. Um, so would you mind turning the radio down, please? Turn the radio down. Get them to do it in pairs, and then get them to maybe exaggerate the intonation patterns together. That would be quite fun as well. Okay, so let's look at some production ideas. We've got board games. Now, board games, it's easy enough to create your own board game. Don't be scared. You can actually, there's a website called twinkle.co.uk, and there are lots of websites, that's just one. And you're provided with like a template, and you can add anything you want your students to be able to produce, any language. What I would do perhaps for something like functional language is in each square of the board game, I put a sentence, and when students land on that square after throwing a dice, they have to give appropriate responses to whatever's written on that square. So, for example, a student, throws a 6, they land on the square that says, "You have to leave work early. Ask your boss." Then they have to use the correct intonation and the correct functional language to ask their boss if they can leave early. Um, Now, in terms of the rules, it's up to the teacher. So you could say, okay, if you've used the correct intonation and the correct expression, then you get 2 points. If you're only using the correct intonation, you only get 1 point, and so on. It's completely up to you. Um, so the winner could be the first person to get to the finish line with the most points. It's up to you how you do it, but students love it. Students love board games. Okay, another one, we've already talked about this briefly, of course, is role play. So you could say to your students, okay, give them each a role. So you could say, you're the employee, you're the boss, you need to leave work early, you're the boss, and you need to make up your mind if you want them to leave early or not. It's up to you. Students then create the dialogue, and then they can role play the dialogue together, of course, using those intonation patterns, exaggerating. So that could be quite fun as well. Another activity, debates. This can get quite lively, okay, especially if you've got a big class with lots of personalities in it. So how would it work? Well, you would just let's say you had taught them functional language for giving opinions, agreeing and disagreeing. You could give each student a card with an opinion on it, or a statement on it, and then get them to debate it out. One side of the classroom could be for it, the other side of the classroom could be against it. And so one person each time, debates the points. So that works quite well. Yeah, so it can get, as I said, it can get quite heated. So, be careful with that one. Discussions as well. Discussion tasks work quite well. So again, discussion cards. Students discuss, what's on their cards using target language. So let's say you're reviewing suggestions. A card could say something like, I want to be a vegetarian. What do you think? And then the other person in the pair would then give them suggestions of what they think. Another task, speaking for 1 minute activities. Very, very similar to the previous task. However, this time the students have to speak for 1 minute, okay, without stopping. And then the last one, This is great. This is a great activity. Of course, we can't do it now because we're all working from home. But working in a school in a classroom setting, this is a really good one. So what happens is in this, you could give your students each a post-it, and they could write a problem for someone else in the class. Make sure you check the problems, make sure they're not being too rude, obviously. So they could write a problem on the back of on the post-it notes and stick it on the back of one of their classmates. So let's say, for example, a problem could be you've got a toothache or something like that. What happens is once each student has got a problem on their back, of course they're not aware of what their problem is. All students stand up, mingle together at some bizarre party, and they're walking around, and students are saying to each other, "Oh, you should do this, or you should do that, or I suggest you do this." So they're using language of suggestion and giving advice, but the student doesn't know what their problem is. So from the advice that they're given and the suggestions they're given, they have to guess what their problem is. This one can work, it really can work very well. Um, and it's actually a lot of fun for students. They really tend to enjoy this. Okay, so this is another production example task, a very simple one. So students write down activities they'd like to do at the weekend and make some notes on why they want to do these things. Give students time to write first, give them time to think about the language they want to use. The task should be designed so that students use a target language, because they then have to get together and use their notes to decide what to do. So, what language you use when you come to an agreement. So think about setting up the task in the way so that the students will automatically use the target language. However, if they don't use a lot of the target language, it's not such a big deal, because as long as they're using appropriate language for that particular situation, that's the important thing. Okay. As long as the language they're using fits the situation, that's okay. Remember that students need to be able to have that fluency practice without you jumping in and correcting them all the time. Otherwise, they just won't ever have that confidence to use a language freely outside of the classroom. Okay. So we've kind of gone through role plays a bit already, but this is a production task, role play, different situations. So your boss wants to buy something nice for her husband's birthday present. What do you suggest? So one student is the boss, the other student is the employee giving the suggestions. Um, so, this can be a lot of fun. Students have control over the language they use, of course, because it's a production activity. You get them to write their dialogue first, and then, of course, they practice it using the appropriate intonation afterwards. Okay, so let's finish by looking at intonation and stress again. So, as discussed, it's really important to you know, make sure that you're raising your students' awareness of intonation, because it actually really does help communicate the message. They can really affect the way the message is being communicated, appropriacy, so turn the music down, please can you turn the music down? Intonation really does play quite a big role in how the message is being communicated. Um, So let's look at some examples of that actually. So consider how intonation can change the meaning here. So just a simple word like what, if you say it in a certain way, it can have various different functions, different meanings. So if we said what, okay, what? It's showing, what's it showing? Negative or positive emotion? Well, it's showing sort of annoyance, I guess, irritation. If you said, "What? What?" It's said in a completely different way, and actually it's showing surprise. What about what? Confusion. So they're all showing, they're all portraying different emotions, really, aren't they? By changing the intonation, you're changing the message. Another one. Yeah, I think it looks great. So this is obviously functional language for giving someone a compliment, yeah, I think it looks great. But if you said it in a different way, if you say it like this, yeah, I think it looks great. Okay, this is really communicating a very different message. This is actually showing sarcasm. So, your advanced level group may enjoy something like this. Looking at other aspects of functional language, like, sounding sarcastic, might be great for an advanced level group who've covered so much functional language through the levels, and you want to challenge them a little bit more. But I would say, think about your learners. What are the needs of your learners again? Going back to those needs. If you've got a lower level class, like an elementary level class, do they really need to be able to communicate using a sarcastic, tone? No, not really. It's not really important for them. It's not appropriate really for them. Um, but it might be something you could do with your higher level group. They might really enjoy it. So, what are the immediate needs of my students? Always consider that. Okay, so to sum up, we've covered a lot of information. We now know what functional language is and why it's important for our learners. It's language they need for every single day of their lives. They're useful phrases for particular situations. I would say the needs analysis is very important in terms of what functional language that you teach your students. As said before, a Japanese businessman living in Tokyo might need functional language for agreeing, disagreeing, or coming to a compromise or something like that. Whereas your student that's living in the UK might just have an immediate need of using functional language for going to the shops and for buying food in a cafe and things like that. So it really does come down to your needs analysis. It would really sort of help you to come up with a clearer idea of what to include in your syllabus. Okay. And remember that your students might know a lot of lexis, a lot of grammar. There might be a grammar whiz, but this doesn't mean that they know what to say in a particular situation. So, it's really important that you expose your students and teach your students appropriate language that they will need for various situations in English. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed the workshop today. If you'd like to see some more useful information, some more workshops, then please do visit galleryteachers.com/ELT workshops. And I'm sure there'll be some really useful, amazing resources for you to use there. Well, the functional approach to teaching English is when the teacher makes a focus of the use of language in real life situations. So basically, your students are using language that they would use in real life situations. This language is designed to be practical and useful for your students. Functionalism actually is an approach to language development that focuses on the relationship between language form and social meaning. This means that language is not a system of rules, but a means of performing particular socially communicative functions. Yes, the functional approach can be used to teach all levels. The functional model of language teaching is applied when language is used for meaningful purposes and to carry out authentic functions. Regardless of the level, your students will need to be able to communicate in a variety of situations in the real world. So, preparing them for this, teaching them communicatively useful expressions will really help them when they go out into the real world. Well, it's important to teach functional language because, right from the beginner level, your students are presented with exponents of high communicative value. The grammar approach really, which you find in a lot of course books, focuses on structure with little regard for actual communication in the target language. So I would say that now course books are changing and they do contain some kind of functional language syllabus within them alongside a focus on grammar and vocabulary, but some of the older course books, they don't do this. They just tend to focus on teaching the grammar. Um, so I think it's really important for our students to be able to have these fixed phrases that they can use in particular situations in the real world, without having to think about, am I using the grammar right, or is this the correct grammar? Because as native speakers, we don't do that. We just speak. We don't think about the grammar. We just know that words sound right together. And we want our students to be able to do the same. We want our students to become fluent speakers. So I really think it's important to teach functional language.